So the title of my talk tonight is The Practice of Forgiveness. And what I hope to be able to demonstrate tonight is the importance of forgiveness as a way of unburdening our hearts of resentment and seeing that carrying resentment is really an obstacle on the path. So I wanted to begin with a couple of questions. What, if anything, did the Buddha teach about forgiveness? What did he have to say about it 2,600 years ago? And can we really make progress on our path without forgiveness of ourselves and others? And where does it fit into our path? And are we talking about both seeking forgiveness and forgiving others? A couple of quotes from the Pali Canon, which is the sort of oldest record of the Buddhist teachings. First one is, "These two are fools." Which two? The one who doesn't see his or her transgression as a transgression, and the one who doesn't rightfully pardon another who has confessed his or her transgression. These two are fools. These two are wise. Which two? The one who sees his or her transgression as a transgression, and the one who rightfully pardons another who has confessed his or her transgression. These two are wise. And then in another one of the discourses, he says, "It's a cause of growth in the Dhamma," meaning the teachings, and the Vinaya, which was the disciplinary code for the monks and nuns. It's a cause of growth in the Dhamma and the Vinaya of the noble ones when, seeing a transgression as such, one makes amends in accordance with the Dhamma and exercises restraint in the future. So clearly in both of these, he's talking about forgiveness. He's opening the door to, within his community at the time, his Sangha, to place some importance on forgiveness. And if we dig into the teachings on forgiveness, we really see what a force this is and what a path this is for peace and harmony in our lives. And I think a really, really important piece of that challenge. And the Buddha gives pretty precise instructions, and I'll talk a little bit about those in a few minutes, for how to achieve both forgiveness and reconciliation. And he makes a distinction, and it's an important distinction, and I want to spend a little time making the distinction between reconciliation and forgiveness. The Pali word, which was the language spoken in the time of the Buddha, the Pali word for forgiveness, kama, Khama, also means the earth. And I thought that was interesting that he uses sort of the sense of the earth and the stability of the earth is the Pali word for forgiveness. And he says that a mind like the earth is non-reactive and unperturbed. And when you forgive me for harming you, and you decide not to retaliate and decide not to seek revenge, then the mind is inclined to be non-reactive and unperturbed. And you can do this without telling me. You can do this without even liking me. It's not about me. It's about what's happening in your own heart and your own mind. And this process allows us to unburden ourselves of the weight of resentment. Resentment can really weigh heavily on us, weigh heavily on our heart. I don't know if the Buddha said this or not. It's been attributed to him, but there's some controversy about whether he said it, but I still think it's a very useful saying. It is, holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else, but you are the one who gets burned. And what forgiveness does, it breaks this cycle of retribution that keeps us entangled in this escalating battle, keeps us enmeshed in this fight, this struggle. And the beauty of forgiveness is that it's a gift that you can give to yourself totally on your own without the transgressor having to know about it or even understand what they've done. It doesn't require their involvement at all, the other person. Now that's as opposed to reconciliation, which implies that both parties are involved with the process. The Pali word for reconciliation is patasaranaya kama, which means a return to amicability. And it requires more than forgiveness. It goes beyond forgiveness. Because it requires that we reestablish trust with myself and the other person. Now, that's not always possible. In many instances, it's not possible. But that's where reconciliation goes one step beyond forgiveness. But if you're seeking to reconcile with me and I deny responsibility for what I've done or my role in the conflict, then there's no way we're going to get there. There's no way reconciliation can happen. It requires a willingness on my part and on your part to come together and resolve whatever the conflict has been. If I insist that your feelings don't matter, or that you have no right to hold me accountable, or you have no right to hold me to your standards of right or wrong, then there's no opportunity for reconciliation again. Because I'm coming defensively, I'm coming without an acknowledgement of my role in whatever the conflict has been. So for that process to begin and to regain your trust, I first have to be willing to admit that I've harmed you or hurt you in some way, and I have to promise that I'll exercise restraint in the future should another problem arise between us. And that asks a lot of us. But on the other hand, you also have to inspire my trust in you. And that partly comes from how you approach me and sort of the general attitude that you bring to the discussion. Because if I sense that you're not fully involved in this process, I'm probably not going to be willing to let my guard down, be willing to engage with you and try to resolve this thing. And this was very important to the Buddha's teaching. He talked about this a lot in terms of his Sangha, in terms of his community of monks and nuns, because conflicts invariably would come up. And he was very specific with them about how they should resolve these conflicts, how they should keep harmony within the Sangha, within the community. As you recall, they would travel around as a fairly large group from community, town to town, and spent hours and hours, waking hours together. So obviously there's going to be some disagreement within the community. So he teaches that there are right and wrong ways to seek reconciliation. Those that he felt skillfully have the greatest opportunity for reconciliation to occur, and those that probably weren't going to work. So he formulated a fairly specific method or series of steps for reconciliation to occur within his community. And it began with a culture of values that encourages putting those methods to use. And some of those values are reflected in the precepts. I mentioned earlier about the precepts course that's coming up. There's a fundamental sort of ethical foundation in terms of the values that he brought to his students then, and which have also been part of his teaching down through the ages. But to briefly summarize the instructions that he gave to his community for seeking reconciliation when there was a conflict, the first step was that in every case there had to be an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. That I acknowledge wrongdoing, you acknowledge wrongdoing. We both in some way have acted unskillfully. And he says when a monk confesses an offense, such as having insulted another monk, he first admits to having said the insult. Step number one. Step number two is then he has to agree that the insult really was offensive, that it really did cause harm or hurt to the other person. And then thirdly, that monk or those monks have to promise to restrain themselves from repeating that particular offense in the future. He then goes on to describe a method for monks or nuns seeking reconciliation with a layperson with whom they've come in contact in their travels, and it's basically the same sequence of steps. He called this, I found this interesting, he called the procedure when the Sangha would break into factions and there would be conflict, he said, first you have to clear the air in a procedure called covering over with grass. And I'm not quite sure what he meant by that. I thought to myself when I read it, I guess that's as opposed to covering your ass. You cover over with grass, so who knows. But both sides make a blanket confession. He requires them to make a blanket confession of wrongdoing and a promise not to bring into the argument minor offenses. You know, this concept sometimes we therapists talk about of bringing in everything but the kitchen sink. He was saying essentially that's not a productive part of the process of reconciliation. And this blanket confession, he said, really frees the two people or however many people up, frees them up to focus on the major transgressions, the major wrongdoings that have caused or exacerbated the dispute, whatever it might have been. And he says to heal a full split in the community or in the Sangha, the two sides were instructed first to inquire into the root intentions on both sides that led to the split. So he's really asking them to sort of search their hearts for what was the intention here. And there he's having people reflect and look at things like, you know, what role is my ego playing in this? What role is my need to be right playing in this? What role is my need to have power over you playing in this? He's really asking them to do some fairly soul-searching self-examination to enter into this process. And if he found, or if the others who were mediating this found that these intentions were malicious or dishonest, then again, reconciliation can't happen. And if the group tries to patch things up without getting to the root of the split, then nothing's really healed. They've just kind of painted over it. So only when the root intentions have been demonstrated to be reconcilable and the differences can be resolved, then the Sangha would have a brief ceremony to reestablish harmony. So this was just such a critical part of his understanding of human behavior, human conflict, and how much of a priority he put on it within his community to have a very clear mechanism in place to resolve these conflicts as they invariably would arise. So reconciliation can't be just a function of a desire for harmony. It's not deep enough. It's not comprehensive enough. It has to have a mutual understanding. There has to be a mutual understanding of what actions created the disharmony in the first place and a real commitment to avoid reenacting those in the future. So, suffice it to say that it can't be about winning or losing the argument. I mean, that's a non-starter. If I enter into this with a notion of I need to win or you need to lose, obviously that's not grounds for any kind of resolution. This is from Philip Moffitt, a teacher at Spirit Rock. He says, there is one other hindrance to the practice of forgiveness you need to examine. And this is the fear that if you forgive, the story of your loss will be forgotten. This is such a painful misunderstanding, and it is widespread. But forgiveness will not cost you your story. By forgiving, you separate the act from the flawed human being behind it. Trust yourself to open to forgiveness. Believe that you can redeem horrible acts by your own vulnerability. So in all of these situations, whether we're talking about forgiveness or reconciliation, and he talked about them both and made that distinction, his overriding instruction was that when we engage in this process, we only speak words that are true, timely, gentle, to the point of the discussion, and prompted by kindness. So those are some of the underpinnings, again, that he felt needed to be in place in order to seek or receive or ask for forgiveness or provide forgiveness or seek reconciliation. So our motivation really needs to be compassion. It really needs to be the sense of the greater good, the welfare of everybody involved, not just my own. And a desire really to see the wrongdoer, if that's what's at play, reconciled and rehabilitated. And really adhere to these principles that he described of right and wrong, those ethical principles that he insisted we needed to try to live by. And the Buddha praised the honest acceptance of blame as an honorable rather than a shameful act. It was not just a means, he said, but the means for progress in spiritual practice. It's said that he told his son Rahula that the ability to recognize one's mistakes and admit them to others is the essential factor in achieving purity in thought, word, and deed. The essential factor, that's pretty strong. This is an instruction he gave to his son. Now, the problem for many of us is that we have this capacity for denial. And the capacity for denial usually results in us minimizing or even denying our role in conflict, our role in what we've done to harm someone. Most of us like to deny that we've acted in ways that are hurtful, acted in ways that have been harmful to others. So how do we combat this? How do we combat this very common human tendency for denial? And again, I'm paraphrasing the Buddha's teachings here, but essentially what he says is that we are always responsible for our conscious choices. We have to step up and accept responsibility. That we should always try to put ourselves in the other person's place, step into their shoes. That we need to go into any situation like this believing that all beings are worthy of respect. So we have to have respect for whoever we're in conflict with. And this one I really love, that we should regard those who point out our faults as if they were pointing out our treasure. That they're really bringing a gift to us by pointing out our faults. They're giving us an opportunity to address those faults and move further along on our spiritual path. And then the fifth one is that there is no higher purpose that excuses breaking the precepts of ethical behavior. There's no justification. That's the other thing we like to do. Well, you made me do it, or I had to do it for this reason or that reason or whatever. He's saying there is no higher purpose that excuses breaking these precepts of ethical behavior. So obviously, what he's saying here is that we really need to employ right speech. If you think about the Eightfold Path, right speech is the one where really comes into play when we're talking about forgiveness and reconciliation. This is from Mahatma Gandhi. He says, "The weak can never forgive. Forgiveness is an attribute of the strong." Now, notwithstanding what I've just said, the reality is, and we all know this, is that not all disputes can be reconciled. Reconciliation is not always an option for many, many reasons. Because very often one or the other party is not willing to engage in this process, which I just described a few moments ago. That's the bad news. The good news is that there's still a place for forgiveness, even if not for reconciliation. There's still an opportunity for us to forgive the other person or to seek forgiveness for whatever we've done. And I think that's why this distinction between forgiveness and reconciliation is so important. Because as much as we might want to seek reconciliation, we're just going to have to settle for times when that's not an option. And then we can always try to work with forgiveness. So this allows us to be generous with our forgiveness even when reconciliation is not an option. Jack Kornfield says, "We have all betrayed and hurt others, just as we have knowingly or unknowingly been harmed by them. It is inevitable in this human realm. Sometimes our betrayals are small, sometimes terrible. Extending and receiving forgiveness is essential for redemption from our past. To forgive does not mean we condone the misdeeds of others. We can dedicate ourselves to make sure that they never happen again. But without forgiveness, the world can never be released from the sorrows of the past." He says, someone quipped, "Forgiveness means giving up all hope for a better past. Forgiveness is a way to move on." In the Dhammapada, which is a series of sayings that are attributed to the Buddha, he gives us instructions that I think is both fierce and compassionate. He says, if someone has abused you, beat you, robbed you, abandon your thoughts of anger. Soon you will die. Life is too short to live with hatred. Bishop Desmond Tutu from South Africa says, "Forgive others, not because they deserve forgiveness, but because you deserve peace." And this is from a man who witnessed unspeakable violence against blacks in South Africa and yet pushed for the truth and reconciliation process after apartheid, if you know that process that he was a major innovator or proponent of to resolve all the hatred and resentment that had been accumulated over the years of apartheid by the blacks in South Africa. Some of you that have been coming here for a while have heard me talk in the past about the challenging relationship that I had with my father when he was living. He died in 2008. He was 89 at the time. And I won't revisit all the ways in which that relationship was difficult and challenging. But suffice it to say that during his life, in all of my life, really until his death, the relationship was distant, it was tense, it was frequently contentious, and I carried a great deal of anger and resentment around for many years toward him and about that relationship. And there was really no opportunity for reconciliation because it wasn't until after his death that I really began to look at my resentments and my hurts, and he was gone, so it was going to be a matter of working with my own heart in terms of trying to address some of that anger and resentment, which had really been such a part of my life up until that point. And through this practice and through the teachings, I really began to see the way in which my anger and resentment had been the result of my holding on to for all of my life, really, to that point, of this fixed idea of how he should be and how he should have treated me. So that was where my clinging to that notion had been so painful and created so much pain in my life. But through the practice, and this is where I think the practice really is such a gift, that once I began to deconstruct this and really forgive him and see clearly how much of this resentment was of my own making, and see clearly all the things about which I had resented him for, and forgive myself for my own role in our relationship and all the problems in the relationship, the weight began to come off at that point. And this power that these grievances had over me and held me for all of my life really began to lift. And that's continued in the almost 8 years since he's been dead. And I just don't carry that anger and that resentment and the weight of that around anymore. So I can tell you that this process works. If you are carrying resentment, if you're carrying hurt, you don't even need the other person to still be around to begin the process of letting go and unburdening your heart of all that anger and resentment. And one of the real unexpected benefits of that process for me has been the sort of scales coming off my eyes and being able to see, to have genuine gratitude for him and see the gifts that he had given me as a father, something I wouldn't see or wouldn't acknowledge before this process. So it really allowed me the opportunity to see him in a different light and see that, in fact, within that situation, which I had always deemed so painful and so unsatisfactory, there were real gifts that had been given to me. It was just a question of me being willing to acknowledge them. This is from Mary Oliver, who's probably my favorite poet. It's called The Settlement. She says, "Look, it's spring, and last year's loose dust has turned into this soft willingness. The windflowers have come up trembling. Slowly the brackens are uplifting their curvaceous and pale bodies. The thrushes have come home, none less than filled with mystery, sorrow, happiness, music, ambition. And I'm walking out into all of this with nowhere to go and no task undertaken but to turn the pages of this beautiful world over and over in the world of my mind. Therefore, dark past, I'm about to do it. I'm about to forgive you for everything." So I wanted to share with you just a brief forgiveness practice that was developed by Rick Hansen. He's a Dharma teacher and a neuroscientist. We had him here a couple years ago. Wonderful teacher. So you just get comfortable and close your eyes for a minute and just follow along with me as I walk us through this forgiveness practice. To those whom I have caused harm, knowingly or unknowingly, through my thoughts, words, and actions, I ask your forgiveness. To those who may have caused me harm, knowingly or unknowingly, through their thoughts, words, and actions, I offer my forgiveness as best as I am able. For any harm I may have caused myself, knowingly or unknowingly, through my thoughts, words, and actions, I offer my forgiveness as best as I am able. So you can open your eyes. A very short, but I think very powerful practice that deals with all aspects of forgiveness towards self and others, and seeking and also providing forgiveness. The other practice that I think can be useful here is a loving kindness, a metta practice, where we really talk about offering loving kindness to those we've harmed, forgiving ourselves for harming ourselves in certain ways, self-compassion. We've talked about that a lot here as well. Because the price for not forgiving is it really closes our heart. It really blocks us. It weights us down. It distracts us. It preoccupies us. Resentment is a very heavy load to carry, as most of us know from experience. So I talked a few minutes ago about denial as a real barrier to this, achieving the peace that comes with forgiveness. But there are other barriers besides denial I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about. One, and boy, this is really one that I have struggled with, is that the unwillingness to let go of our hurt, our resentment, our anger, because we feel we're right and we feel like it gives us the moral high ground. And I feel like I'm justified in carrying this around because you wronged me, and therefore I'm entitled to carry this hurt and resentment and anger. and it gives me the moral high ground with you in comparison to you. A related piece of that is that we wear our resentments like a badge of honor, like we've earned a medal or something. And we'll tell anyone that'll listen what our struggle has been and what resentments we're carrying and what a load that is. And we really think that gives us, again, the moral high ground. Another barrier is that we fail to recognize that we practice forgiveness for our own sake, to not be locked into hate, fear, and resentment. That the practice is really to our own benefit, that it doesn't cost us anything at the end of the day to offer forgiveness. Very often our minds get so clouded with anger and resentment and hatred that we just can't see the path. We're so distracted by the depth of our resentment that we don't see a way out of it. And this is where practice can really begin to, as I say, have the scales dropping away from our eyes. If we're unable to identify with our pain and acknowledge it, that's another barrier. Because I want to disavow, push my pain away. We have to really be willing to look at it and face it and acknowledge it before we can begin the process of forgiveness. And this is a big one, and one that I think is many of us have experienced. It's the fear that if we forgive someone, that somehow we're approving of their behavior, that somehow if I forgive you, I'm saying what you did was okay. And we fail to see that by forgiveness opens our hearts, it really softens us. It takes the edge off. You know, over the years, I'd see this again and again in my professional life when I was working with folks that had very often had a history of sexual abuse in their lives. And the feeling would often be that if I try to offer forgiveness here, it's letting the perpetrator off the hook. I'm giving them a pass. And the difficulty moving beyond that and seeing that it's not about them. It's about freeing up our own heart. You'll recall that the Buddha taught that hate never dispels hate. He said only love dispels hate. There's the story of the two monks who were released from prison after they'd been tortured by the Chinese in Tibet for many, many years. And this is many years later. And one runs into the other and says, "Have you forgiven them?" And the other monk says, "No, I'll never forgive them, never." And the first monk says, "Well, I guess they still have you in prison." This is a poem from Paul Verlaine, the French poet of the 19th century, called "You See, We Must Be Forgiven Things." You see, we must be forgiven things. That way we will find happiness. And if our life has moments of sadness, at least we shall weep together. Oh, if only our sister souls could blend, our confused desires with childish tenderness, and wander on far from men and women, in the cool forgetfulness of that which has exiled us. Let us be children. Let us be two little girls who are enamored by nothing and amazed by all, who grow pale in their chaste bowers without even knowing they have been forgiven. So what are sort of some of the more general rules then about forgiveness, seeking it, offering it? You know, always remember that we always need to remember to take care of ourselves. This process is not about opening ourselves up for further harm by someone. It's not about that. You know, we may be working on forgiveness, but at the same time, we're not going to open ourselves up for somebody to keep hurting us. You know, seek support, seek a community. That's part of what we offer, is community. You know, talk to a teacher, talk to a friend. Air the stuff out. Don't carry it around. It gets much heavier when you're carrying it around by yourself. We have to open, as painful as it is, we have to open to the experience. We have to honor the fact that we've been wounded, that we've been harmed. We want to create some spaciousness around it, the idea that if we just get tunnel vision, it'll just burn and burn. Whereas if we can open to it and open it up, it becomes more tolerable. And forgiveness and forgiving resentment is like so many other things, that analogy of putting a teaspoon of salt in a cup of water. You can't drink it. Put it in a lake. Create that kind of spaciousness, and it's very much more manageable. And again, don't get caught up in the story, telling everyone how awful, how terrible, how unforgivable it was. Be careful about attributing intent to others, well, they did this to me because I deserved it, or because of this or that. It's very easy to get caught up in our own story, and our own story of the transgressions that we feel we've experienced. And really appreciate the value of forgiveness. Ask ourselves, what is this resentment that I'm carrying costing me? What is it costing me emotionally? What is it costing me in terms of the load that I have to carry around? What would it be like to just set the burden of this down? Might that be much better than whatever payoff there is for carrying it around, for whatever moral high ground we think we get from carrying it around, holding on to it? We talk a lot about causes and conditions. How did we all get to where we are? Causes and conditions, experiences, ancestors, whatever. And if we look upstream from where we are with our hurt and resentment, we can see a whole series of causes and conditions: family, parents, finances, childhood, temperament. The list goes on and on. And that, again, helps us create some spaciousness around the hurts and resentments. Tunnel vision is a real barrier to achieving this kind of peace in our lives. There's an old saying, each day wounds and the last one kills. We all get wounded. But that's not to say we shouldn't protect ourselves. We shouldn't protect ourselves from people that are trying to hurt us. But part of the price of being alive is that we're going to get hurt, we're going to get wounded. And the process of forgiveness is a way of handling that in a way that doesn't bog us down. So I'd just like to close with a quote from the writer Anne Lamott. And she says, "Forgiveness means it finally becomes unimportant that you hit back. You're done. It doesn't necessarily mean you want to have lunch with the person. But if you keep hitting back, you stay trapped in the nightmare." So may the burden of your suffering be lifted by forgiveness. So let's just sit for a minute. So Thank you for your time and attention. Have a good week.